Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Maybe we could have a chat about some of the schools and young people's projects that we're developing in Wales through the Darwin Centre later this afternoon. But I thought it would be appropriate to start my presentation with Asa Gray. The biography I have of him says that he was very supportive of developing the Arnold Arboretum. I hope that's correct. But of course he has a very, very important part to play in the Darwin story, because he met Darwin at Kew as a result of Hooker, and they became very friendly, particularly with something like 300 letters that went between them over the years. And of course the key letter was written in September 1857, and it was part of the evidence presented by Lyell and Hooker to the Linnean Society on the 1st of July 1858. One phrase I selected from it by Darwin: I think it can be shown that there is such an unerring power at work in natural selection, the title of his book, of course he changed the title, which selects exclusively for the good of each organic being. But the reason I particularly selected him today to start my presentation is because if you look at these letters closely, you will often find this sort of quote from Darwin. But the worst is that my health is failing much. I literally cannot listen to a novel for half an hour without fatigue. I must go with my whole family if my girl get me moved for 2 months for a water cure. And another example to Hooker: I've had a bad spell, vomiting every day for 11 days and some days after every meal. So Darwin was ill for over 40 years. On and off, but some of his episodes lasted weeks at a time and wiped him out. This is documented in dozens of his letters, several books, his autobiography, his health diary, and now many peer-reviewed articles. So he married Emma, of course, in 1839, and they lived in Gower Street in London. But and in 1837, just 2 years before, he states he had heart palpitations, eczema, erythema, and headaches. This was the main driving force that he moved to Down, because they hoped, going into country air, that he would have less of the symptoms that he was starting to have regularly. And it's interesting to note, there was a very interesting book published some years ago called Creative Malady. How much work would he have actually done if he'd stayed in London and got involved in committees, writing grant applications, writing health and safety risk assessments and all that sort of stuff? So there's an interesting positive outcome that came from his illness. So what were his symptoms? Well, he first reported it actually while he was waiting to go on the Beagle. He never told anybody, because he thought they wouldn't let him go. He had heart palpitations. He thought he had a heart attack. So he didn't dare tell anybody, because he really obviously wanted to go on the Beagle. There was a second report, as I've shown, in 1837, and in his diary of health. Crucially, though he was ill on the Beagle occasionally, and of course, as you know, he had seasickness, something I know myself, research cruises I got been on, but he didn't have the symptoms which we associate with his long-term illness. Chronic fatigue, severe gut problems, nausea and vomiting, headaches, swimming head, visual disturbances, skin rashes, mouth ulcers, tooth and gum problems, joint pain, heart palpitations, insomnia, trembling, hot and cold attacks, depression and hysteric sobbing. Will you be sobbing if you had all that sort of symptoms and nobody worked out what was wrong with you? His final illness was probably an anginal attack in April 1882. And he grew a beard, actually, after one of his ill health episodes in 1860. But none of these symptoms did he have on the Beagle. There have been over 40 diagnosed, proposed, over 150 years since he first recorded his heart palpitations. And these are 3 of the well-known books which go into it in considerable detail. So these are some of the proposals. The first is psychosomatic, bereavement syndrome, hyperventilation and depression. So of course you get depressed if you had all those symptoms and nobody could sort it out. But I think all the experts that in his illness today would reject completely that it was a psychosomatic illness. It had an organic cause. Arsenic poisoning was proposed. Chagas disease is a popular one because of the great bug of the pampas, which contains a trypanosome which causes Chagas disease. One of the officers of the beagle kept one as a pet. You actually get the infection through the feces, but it's called the kissing bug because he had it on his lips. He woke up at night and it was biting him on his lips. But the symptoms of Chagas disease do not fit. This is another recent suggestion that doesn't fit. John Heyman in Australia, I met him, he came to stay with us. Because of the association with the female side of the family, he argued that it had a mitochondrial mutation. Turns out this is not correct. There have been various gut ailments described. We would say that the only problem that fits all the symptoms is lactose and food intolerance. That's what I want to try and convince you about. Of course, he had lots of treatments from about 20 doctors, including his father. He was a regular snuff taker. It wasn't a treatment, but he took it. His father proposed all sorts of nasty poisons, mercury, arsenic. He didn't take arsenic, I don't think, because his father didn't like it. And his daughter loved bread and milk, apparently. Well, this is a disaster if you happen to be lactose intolerant. Of course, Annie tragically died at the age of 9. Moving to down was a treatment, but the only really successful therapy seems to have been this water therapy cure, which he first took from Dr. Gully in Malvern. So this water cure is very, very interesting because it meant a very restricted diet, very little sugar, and critically, very little milk or dairy products. So there were 3 places he went to. I forgot how to use this. Which is the one I press? The top one. So this is where I live, of course, in Wales. Here, Cardiff in Pembrokeshire. So Dr. Gully, he didn't go there because Annie died in Malvern. He couldn't go back there. He had a place near London in Surrey, but there was a scandal for the owner, so he didn't go there. And then he went up to Ilkley in Yorkshire. This is a particularly interesting episode because it was during the episode that the Origin of Species was published, the first edition. And the correspondence he had there was quite substantial. He could not have had that if he wasn't well. So this water cure involved all sorts of bizarre things. He did actually build a cold shower when he got back to town, wrapping yourself up in water sheets, drinking lots of water, this restricted diet. But then you can see there's a quote, "No time must I eat sugar, butter, spices, tea, bacon, or anything good. He allowed me only a little milk." So he wrote to people, his son, Hooker, his great friend, "The water cure has done me much good. I'm hydrophizing and coming to life again after having finished my cursed book on the origin of species." In his autobiography, "I went to Malvern for hydropathic treatment, which did me much good." And he said he couldn't go to his father's funeral because he was ill again. So the basic thing was, when he had his home cooking from Emma, he was ill. When he had the water cure cooking, he was well. So this is just a brief summary of some of the interesting correspondence when he was at Ilkley. This information actually was brought to my attention by a fellow council member, Mark Seward, of course comes from Yorkshire. But it is a very interesting set of correspondence, including sending editions of On the Origin to various people, famous people and colleagues and friends. One of the most interesting set of correspondences with Lyell, who was, of course, very sceptical about the principle of natural selection. By the end, he does seem to have convinced Lyell that natural selection was a scientific truth. But the point is, if he'd been ill all the time, he could not possibly have had this correspondence. So the next question is, what have all these got in common? The answer is that, and particularly that. So lactose is the sugar in milk. It's a very high concentration. In cow's milk, it's about 50 grams per litre. In human milk, it's about 70. But the only place you find large amounts of lactose in nature is in mammalian milk. And as you will all know, the monkeys don't keep cattle. And the point about that is that after you've come off the mother's breast, there's no point in keeping the enzyme which breaks this. In order to digest it, you have to clip it in two, because you can't absorb disaccharides. You can only absorb galactose and glucose separately. So all mammals, except white northern European and some other races like the Bedouins, lose most of their lactase after weaning. So if you're Chinese, you've lost about 95% of it by the time you're 5 or 6 years old. I think this has some interesting evolutionary consequences, because remember, dairying is only about 8,000 years old. It's very recent in human history, and I think it must have had a very important impact on the humans that became the white northern Europeans, enabling them to move up into the plains of Europe when the last big ice sheet melted 10,000 years ago, because there was a mutation which occurred where the enzyme lactase is retained after weaning. So if you work it out, 4,000 million people around the world can't digest lactose properly. There's a further problem, because since the Second World War, there's a huge lactose industry developed. Of course, this wouldn't have affected Darwin. So in the United States, the current production of lactose is about 500 million kilograms per year, and it's added all over the place to foods without it being properly labelled. So here's an example of one patient that we've had. My wife is a medic, so she set up the first food intolerance clinic in Wales, against quite a lot of resistance, I might say. So this is one of her patients, and you can see that she had eczema, asthma, arthritis. She had diarrhea, nausea, sickness, a lot of the symptoms that Darwin had. She was on all sorts of drugs. So she came to the clinic, and one of the ways you could test it was to give a patient a whack of lactose, measure breath hydrogen. We also measure breath methane. Went up a bit, but it wasn't really convincingly diagnostic. However, when she recorded the symptoms she had during the test, she had all these classic symptoms like Darwin: headaches, vomiting. It went on for several days. Lightheadedness, loss of concentration, heart palpitations. So my wife advised her how to cut off lactose. Within literally a couple of weeks, her skin was wonderful. She'd been on an operation list for a knee replacement. She could then run to the shops, and the medication was reduced to nothing. Now, we've had many, many cases dramatic like that. So Stephanie, my wife, has had well over 1,000 cases. They're not all as dramatic because it is a complicated condition to manage, because a lot of them also are gluten sensitive. But many of them, it's transformed their lives. So we would say they're lactose intolerant. I would prefer to say they're lactose sensitive, because everybody can take some lactose. It depends what your threshold is. Now, unfortunately, one day I was with my wife in the clinic, and her line manager came in and said, Stephanie, I'm afraid that your clinic is too successful, so we're closing it. It was politically unacceptable because the Ministry of Health at the Welsh Assembly was saying that all waiting lists were less than 6 months. Hers was 18 months because she was completely inundated with patients from consultant colleagues and general practitioners. So our revision in the textbooks, you'll see that it's all gut related. 25% of our patients get constipation, not diarrhea. And of course, some of them do get nausea and vomiting. But the crucial thing is the systemic symptoms, which vary enormously in amount and number between different patients. So you've got headaches, like loss of concentration, tiredness, muscle pain, allergies, heart arrhythmias in 25%, muscle spasms increase, and of course depression. But that, I suspect, was usually because people get depressed when they've had all this sort of thing without it being sorted. We had 2 possible other ones which haven't got enough numbers: hearing loss and infertility. So we had 5 patients who become unexpectedly pregnant. My wife warns patients now that if you come off lactose, watch out. But I can tell you from personal experience, it is true. Anyway, but this could be very important because a lot of IVF clinics recommend their patients to take milk. This could be a disaster if the reason they're infertile is because they're lactose sensitive. So here is a summary of the symptoms we would say are lactose sensitive, and Darwin, how he described it. And you can see there is a complete match-up. But all the symptoms that we see with lactose sensitive patients, Darwin had them all. He got better with no milk, with the on the beagle and water cure. He got worse when he was on milk. So I'm a biochemist, so I obviously got very interested in the mechanism of this. So here we have lactose, sucrose, and isomaltose, which comes from starch metabolism. So as I said earlier, you can only absorb in the small intestine monosaccharides. These are particularly interesting. They're found in root vegetables. They block the uptake of galactose and glucose. So if you eat these with starch, that's why you produce a lot of flatus. So if you have a low lactase, you could be congenital deficient, very rare. We've never seen cases. There is a group in Finland. Inherited loss after weaning, which is very common, particularly in non-white Europeans. Gut infections, but these are reversible, usually. This is a very important point clinically. That recently we've discovered that a lot of people who have radiotherapy who've had cancer, like prostate cancer, gut cancer, that the radiation damages the gut and they become lactose sensitive. And then in aging, this is an area that needs to be looked at, but it looks as though there is a hormone imbalance. And then there's a biochemical issue about whether it's transcription or enzyme processing, which is the mechanism of losing the protein. These are the 2 which we would suggest would have caused Darwin to be lactose sensitive. He could have had a protozoal infection in the gut, but that should have been reversible, but inherited loss after weaning is the most likely one. So how could one sugar cause all these systemic symptoms and gut symptoms? When you digest sugars, if it's not absorbed in the small intestine, it hits the gut microbes in the large intestine. There's not much oxygen there. So to make ATP, you've got to get rid of hydrogen. And so we do it, of course, by producing L-lactate. Bacteria sometimes produce D-lactate. They also often have a hydrogenase, which was discovered by Marjorie Stevenson in Cambridge, our Cambridge, which produces the major gas of flatus. But then what I realised is that you also get a whole load of other metabolites, diols, alcohols, aldehydes and ketones, which don't look very nice. And there's a crucial one which is produced by a number of bacteria. It is a primitive antibiotic called methylglyoxal. So how could these actually cause all these symptoms? Well, the ion that has been the centrepiece of my research for the last 40 years is calcium. I spent most of my time trying to prove that it is the most important universal signal in the whole of life. And the key experiment is to measure it inside a live cell, which I did with bioluminescent proteins. And it turns out that in all animal cells, all plant cells, all fungal cells, all microbes, eukaryotic, all bacteria and all archaea, there's a huge calcium gradient across the membrane of all cells. You have a sub-micromolar concentration in the cytosol and millimolar or more outside. And it switches on, it's a chemical switch. So I tried to document this in a book I published last year, which has a Darwinian theme. I'd just like to, hopefully not controversially, but make the point that as a molecular scientist, it isn't just about structural proteins. What makes a cheetah catch an antelope is whether it can run fast enough and the antelope can't escape it. And it's the signalling system which determines whether it can run fast enough or whether the antelope can escape. When you look at the signalling proteins associated with calcium, there's a huge molecular biodiversity. So we have 3 calmodulin genes, we have 6 calmodulin-like genes. These have subtly different biochemical properties. We have alternative splicing, we have differences in expression. This means that each cell has a slightly different physiological response when it's activated to do something. So I think this is a crucial part of evolution. Furthermore, I would argue, as I have in this book, that one of the most important chemical events that occurred in primeval cells before they could do anything was to get rid of this. Because if you have calcium in your cells, it clogs everything up. So when you die, calcium rushes into the cells and it wrecks everything. It wrecks DNA, it wrecks RNA, it wrecks proteins, it coagulates everything. It precipitates phosphate. So the hypothesis was that these bacterial metabolic toxins would interact with the calcium signaling system, and that's how they produce these diverse symptoms. So we've done a few experiments to demonstrate the feasibility of it, a lot more to do. Set up the Daphnia system, which I found in my pond. We use it for schools. It's a fantastic system. It has a great benefit over Drosophila. It's transparent, so you don't have to open it up. This has a heart, which is 0.1 of a millimetre long, and I showed that it will respond to all the agents that the human heart responds to. And using an imaging system, I was able to convert the video to a trace. Lactose reduced the heart rate, removing it increased the heart rate. Methylglyoxal, one of the putative toxins, metabolic toxins, affects calcium-activated potassium channels detected by patch clamping. It has a negative inotropic effect. It causes contraction of gilipig ileum. So all of these are regulated by calcium. Remember, each second your beating heart is triggered to beat by a little puff of calcium. Every nerve in your brain that is firing because there's a puff of calcium in each nerve terminal which triggers the release of the neurotransmitter. Furthermore, we've shown that some of these agents cause covalent modification of extracellular signals. So methylglyoxal causes a covalent modification of 5-hydroxytryptamine, which could be a mechanism which would cause constipation because the smooth muscle would stop contracting in your gut. We've also shown that it causes covalent modification and inactivation of insulin. And one exciting discovery for me was that I had a grant to look at calcium in bacteria using a genetically engineered bioluminescent protein to measure the free calcium in live bacteria. So at 6 o'clock, everybody had left, and I thought, well, I'll have a look and see if by chance these metabolic toxins do something. They do. This is the first discovery of calcium signals in bacteria. They all generate these calcium signals. We've also shown that when you get calcium signals in bacteria using microarray, you activate or deactivate about 90 genes. Also, you can affect cell growth. So high concentration of methyl-galoxyl blocks cell growth. When it's degraded, then the growth occurs again. So at least this is consistent with our hypothesis. These metabolic toxins affect cells around the body. But they could also affect the balance of gut microbes. What about DNA? So there is a big family history of this illness. His paternal grandmother, Erasmus's first wife, died at age 30. It's about alcoholism, but I think she took the alcohol because she had terrible gut trouble. His mother, of course, died when he was only 8 years old, and certainly some of her symptoms which are available to us match his, not all of them. His brother never worked. He was ill. People described the Darwin tribe as a sickly lot because they all had parts of his symptoms. His uncle, Tom Wedgwood, had headaches and abdominal pain. Mary Wedgwood died aged young. So on. There's a big family history. And when I gave this presentation to the Linnean Society a couple of years ago, question time, a lady got up from the front and she said, "I'm the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles Darwin, and I'm lactose intolerant." So that was quite encouraging. Now, there was a programme on television a couple of years ago which caused a lot of controversy because one of the people that he chose was called Dead Famous DNA. We had Napoleon's penis and various other things, but she wasn't allowed to show, apparently. Anyway, they had some of Darwin's hairs. So they say they'd done a DNA, they'd done a genomic sequence. They haven't got a complete sequence. It doesn't have the mitochondrial mutation. But it does apparently have a mutation for a protein called NOD2, which is associated with gut disorders. It's a risk gene. But of course, there's been a bit of squabbling about the publication. It hasn't been subject to peer review, so at the moment it's anecdotal. Mitochondrial mutation, which John Heyman predicted, apparently is not present, so it doesn't fit his hypothesis. But there is a very important polymorphism just upstream from lactase in this helicase gene, which was described by a Finnish group. We set up the first clinical test for it using, an old-fashioned PCR method. So these are the two polymorphisms in these introns. So you can be CC, you can be CT, or you can be TT. What we found was if you're CCGG, 100% of the patients were lactose sensitive. But you could still be lactose sensitive if you had CT or TT. So if this is on chromosome 2, if we could find that mutation, that polymorphism, with Darwin, it would prove 100% he was. But even if he didn't have it, then we could still say that the symptoms fit. So I'd like to end with a bit about evolution, because I think this is highlighted to me as a biochemist one of the most important problems in evolution, and that is the origin of a new protein. There are two proteins that cleave lactose. Beta-galactosidase, very, very famous in the foundation of molecular biology, and lactase. This is a unique enzyme. It has two active centres, one of which hydrolyzes lactose, the other a poison from apple bark called fluoridin. Its natural substrate is cerebroside. So you need to keep some because you need lipids for your myelin. But if I expect to test you at the end of the day about these sequences, I'm sure you'll remember most of them. But I mean, it's obvious that these proteins are completely different. That's the point. There is no sequence similarity between them, yet they both catalyze the same reaction. So this was highlighted by a very famous astrophysicist called Fred Hoyle. Now, I've been lucky enough to study one of the most wonderful phenomena on this planet, which is bioluminescence, which combined my love of nature, which I'd had since I was 6 years old, with my curiosity about chemistry. And what I discovered was that there was a particular chemical which causes the light emission in 8 phyla. It's the most common chemistry causing bioluminescence in the sea, which I discovered on research cruises on Discovery off the northwest coast of Africa. Now, Darwin had a big problem with bioluminescence. Interestingly, the first description in his zoology notebooks is bioluminescence. It's not in Journal of Researches, but I discovered it because in our Cambridge, the university library has his handwritten zoology books. And the first two items are bioluminescence, almost certainly dinoflagellates. I'm sure some of you will know Woody Hastings, and Woody was one of the great gurus of bioluminescence and studied dinoflagellates for many years. But Fred Hoyle, Darwin had a problem in chapter 6, Difficulties on Theory. How could small change by small change lead to a new phenomenon? It's scattered, it doesn't work. How could you produce a new protein? Now, Hoyle mathematically said it can't work. It's like constructing a jumbo jet by a whirlwind going through a junkyard. Mathematically just cannot work. So here is the bioluminescent protein I've worked a lot with from a luminous jellyfish. The jellyfish luminescence was first described by a pupil of Linnaeus, Peter Forschool. And this is the reaction it catalyzes. As you also know, I'm sure, fish and shrimp don't eat apples. So these deep sea animals need something to protect themselves against oxygen. So this is almost certainly a vitamin C type molecule. But it causes luminescence. But if you look at the sequence here, you have 196. The number of potential possibilities is absolutely huge. If I looked at lactase, it's even bigger. It's just absolutely massive. There are only 10 to the power 80 atoms in the universe. This is why Hoyle said it's impossible. But he was wrong, and I think it's been quite exciting to me to use bioluminescence to show that if you have a protein with a pocket in it, I'm just finishing here, then it will produce, in this case, bioluminescence. The only thing you need is a pocket with the right electrochemistry to produce the catalytic reaction you're looking at, whether it's hydrolysis of lactose or bioluminescence. So, in conclusion, the evidence of Darwin's illness is it was organic with gut and systemic symptoms. We would argue these match exactly those we found for lactose intolerance in type and timing. Other proposed diagnoses do not explain all his symptoms. There is a family history. He only got better when he stopped or reduced milk. It got worse when he took sugar and milk. There is a search for his DNA. If we could show he was CC, this would be proof. And we have a potential molecular mechanism which none of the other suggestions have. It has other important consequences because it causes other conditions, these toxins. I think there are some important diseases that we should be looking at: Parkinson's, type 2 diabetes, and certain types of cancer, which correlate with increased milk intake. So my last slide is a personal one because, as with many people, when you study a medical problem, there is a personal reason for doing it. So this is my wife. This is taken a couple of years ago, actually. But anyway, so it turned out that she was lactose intolerant very severely, and she had all Darwin symptoms. And that was the eureka moment that I realised that they matched. But it's had a big impact. You'll notice that my daughter-in-law here is Ugandan in origin. Well, she's British, but she's ethnically Ugandan. So we have 3 nice grandchildren. She is very severely lactose intolerant. We discovered this before she got pregnant. This is our daughter, Georgina, with our lovely granddaughter that I've been staying with the last 2 or 3 days. We discovered Georgina was lactose intolerant because of her mother. She was underperforming. As a result, she got into Oxford, or the other place, as the Cambridge people would say. And so she is very sensitive to lactose. She got into Oxford. She did a fantastic project with Bob Langer here at MIT Harvard, got a prize for it. And she now runs a international entrepreneurial program at MIT. She's very active. They've got a big weekend at the moment at MIT. None of this would have happened if we hadn't discovered she was lactose sensitive. So it's had a big impact on our family, but it also has highlighted this very interesting question about evolution to a biochemist. What is the origin of a new protein? And I think we have at least a hypothesis about how that could occur. Thank you.